things that I wanted to talk about, but then in listening to you, I got a whole nother script, so I guess I don't know where to start. So I'll start here. I was fascinated by your title, Looking for Jimmy, right? So on the one hand, it's very straightforward and very unembellished, very straightforward, but then it also suggests, even to those like you most closest to him, a type of elusiveness, a type of unknowability. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that paradox, if not contradiction.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, when I was trying to think of the title, it sort of came to me that I had spent many years looking for Jimmy. Even though I lived with him, I was with him every day for long periods of time, I was still always looking for him, because there was always a side of him which was invisible, which is maybe why one wanted to write a biography.
Yes.
I mean, why do you need to know more than what he already said or did? I suppose I was looking for some sort of consistency, some sort of meaning in the way, in the way that he was. I mean, that leads to the whole question of what he really meant by love. And I suppose that was the thing that, looking back on his life and also on my biography, I kept asking myself, have I really dealt with the question of what he meant by love? And as you can tell from the talk, that was an issue that still haunts me, really. What did he mean? How can we take that sense of love that he has, that sort of non-Hallmark card sense of love, and make it applicable to our lives? And how can we move from a limited sense of love to the sense that love means Giovanni's room? I mean, it means giving up something. It means giving up something of what you have to relate to someone else. It means taking off your mask,
Right.
which is very hard to do.
Right.
And there were some times when I felt that Jimmy was wearing a mask, and it was sometimes hard to break through, especially in his later years when he was very disillusioned with the possibilities that the love he was expressing could become informative and applicable to our situation as a nation or as people.
I like, in the latter part of your talk, you spoke very specifically about Baldwin's novels, and you sort of traced the arc of the characters. It's fascinating that most of his protagonists are artists: Sonny, Rufus, Fonnie, Ida Scott, Arthur Montana in his last novel, which is not read much at all. Leo Proudham, and you mentioned Tell Me How Long the Train has been gone. And so there are all of these artists who populate his fiction. Can you talk about perhaps what you think he was trying to say through these artists about the nature of love? And do you think ultimately it is that perhaps elusiveness of love itself that may have been the voices that Buford Delaney heard that ultimately consumed him, right? So this lack of love seemed to be, you know, in your biography you mentioned the word loneliness a lot.
Right.
And so.
Well, there is, I mean, I think you're leading to, there's a connection between Baldwin's personal search for love and the kind of love that's discussed metaphorically, perhaps, in the novels through characters such as the one you mentioned. I think that's true. His life was in many ways a tragic search for love personally. He did have people he loved. I mean, there was one person he loved all his life, but the failure of that person to return the kind of love that he needed.
And that would have been Lucien.
That would have been Lucien, yes. But he became a pattern for many of Jimmy's lovers, and the failure to translate that love into his political and social life as an artist was evident.
Right. You and also mentioning those works and Baldwin's sort of growing despair. One thing I've always noticed in his fiction, I would say beginning in 1968 would tell me how long the train has been going. It's sort of a shift in tone in Baldwin. I can see his really obsession in those first three novels with love, the price of love, the difficulty of love, the arduous task of it. But it seems like by 1968, as you pointed out, he sort of began to be, I don't know, disillusion might be a strong word, but there clearly seems to be a shift in tone in 68. And so in 74, you get If Beale Street Could Talk, which is, to use the words he used to describe Richard Wright's work, a bitter protest novel. And so you get this sort of shift from the sort of almost Christian inflected notion of, loving thy neighbor as thyself, and black people, needing to love white people and vice versa. And then it seems like there's something that seems to have happened to him. Am I misreading that?
No, I think that's true. I think there is a disillusionment, a sense that we've somehow failed in the act of love between races, for example, which involves the unmasking and the giving up of something.
Yes.
Rather than simply the taking of something. I think it is, the last novels are marked by disillusionment, by the failure of love. And also, I think in terms of his personal life, there was a coming revelation that the personal love that he attempted to find was never there somehow. That there were plenty of people who would be lovers, but who really had nothing to do with his sense of a deeper love that could be translated into love between peoples.
Would you go as far as to say that people were willing to exploit his celebrity?
Oh, yes, they were. There were many, many examples, especially in Saint Paul de Vence, where he lived, where David literally had to send away some of the people who were obviously taking advantage of Jimmy, and his vulnerability, and his pain in the later part of his life.
You mentioned Tennessee Williams. Yesterday I was teaching for a colleague's class, and I was teaching Giovanni's room, and I brought up Tennessee Williams and how they weren't quite contemporaries. Tennessee Williams was older than Baldwin, but they were, around in the 1950s, and they both faced virulent homophobia, and how, Tennessee Williams tried to deal with that clearly in his works, through psychotherapy, and just that connection. So I was really glad to hear you, and I forgot or didn't know that he actually knew Tennessee Williams.
He did. In fact, I've only met Tennessee Williams once, and that was with Baldwin at Marlon Brando's temporary house on Brompton Square in London, when he was working with Charlie Chaplin on Chaplin's last film. And Marlon had a dinner party after the shot that we went to watch, which was itself amusing because it was Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren, who were both method actors. And, method actors have to believe that they really like each other if they're going to kiss, for example. Well, there was a scene that Chaplin was directing, and he was saying to them, "Kiss as if you believed it," but they couldn't because they hated each other. And so finally, Chaplin, who's a little old man at this point, you know, he went over and he said, "Marlon, for Christ's sake, this is how you kiss." He took Sophia by his arms and he kissed her.
Wow.
And that was an interesting evening. But that evening, Brando had a dinner party, and one of the guests, or two of the guests were Tennessee Williams and his then partner, whose name I can't remember.
Frank Merlot.
It could have been, yeah. And you know, that was, I must say, a fascinating evening for me. I wish by then I had realized I was a biographer instead of somebody watching, because of course I drank too much and I didn't, all I cared about was that it's Tennessee Williams, they're Marlon.
And we know Tennessee Williams and Baldwin didn't like alcohol, right?
Also, I remember that the most impressive thing about the evening was that Marlon and Tennessee both ate their asparagus by hand. and I was told that in Europe that's what you can do anyway. But they taught me that, how to eat asparagus by hand.
Where's Leah? Hi Leah, how are we doing for time?
Oh, we're doing great for time. If you want to keep going a little longer.
Because we want to have time for the audience to
Audience
engage.
questions, I'm happy to ask.
Okay, I want to ask David one more thing and then we'll
Sure.
go to the audience
Yeah.
questions. So David, you brought up a topic that's always fascinated me, and that's Baldwin on film. I haven't been that happy with the film adaptations of his work. And you mentioned Another Country, which I think would be the perfect novel.
He
lends
desperately
itself.
wanted it.
And so, what have been your impressions about the film versions of his work, and why do you think there hasn't been a film version of Another Country which lends itself with this, with this sort of pulsating discussion of such high-level topics about race and sexuality and sexual orientation, right? It lends itself
It does.
to a film version, and yet they chose Beale Street, which is a very conventional book, and Go Tell It on the Mountain is built onto his first novel, and the film version really was wanting.
It was a minor version, done for TV.
Yeah.
Well, there are several reasons, but I remember the reason we went to London that first time was really to talk to the director, Joseph Losey. Many of you probably know his work, like The Servant was one of his, or For King and Country. And Baldwin really loved Losey's work and agreed with him politically in various ways. Losey was one of the Americans who was sort of exiled to England during the McCarthy years. And we went and spent a whole day with Losey while he tried to explain to Jimmy while his screenplay, because Jimmy had written a screenplay for Another Country, and Losey explained to him why it wouldn't work. He said, first of all, if I were directing it, I would want to have something to say about how it's being done. And Jimmy's screenplay was about this thick. And he said, Jimmy, here's an example of a screenplay by Harold Printer, which is this big, and it was for The Servant, which is a great film. And Jimmy was too involved with the screenplay aspect of it. And he just wasn't the kind of writer whose work lent itself to screen work. And I think he knew that.
Right.
Too.
It sounds like he just wasn't willing to let it go enough.
He wasn't willing to let it go enough, that's true.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that. I'd like, Leah, do you want to, if the audience members have questions, by all means, please engage David.
Does anyone want to ask a question?
I have a question.
Right here.
Okay.
She's going to bring the microphone.
Okay.
Maybe we can say our name.
Okay. I'm Talani. You had mentioned Keith
Keith had mentioned, that he had sensed a kind of shift in tone or sentiment around, Baldwin's novel during 1968. And I'm wondering if you think that, you know, the culmination of the deaths of his friend, Medgar Evers in 63, Malcolm in 65, and then King in 68, had any impact on what Keith sensed in his work.
Definitely. Those three murders, especially, maybe especially Medgar Evers, he was very close to personally, had got to know very well. I think these three murders were devastating to him. And they made him lose hope to a great extent. And I think that certainly is reflected in the fact that he left the States to come back to Istanbul in the middle of the civil rights period. That combined with the fact that he had been criticized as a Tom by Eldridge Cleaver and others, which really disturbed him, because he worked so hard to free Huey Newton and had worked hard to support Angela Davis and her problems. I mean, I think he was just disillusioned. I think, however, he tried to do something else with those novels, and they shouldn't be underrated completely. Maybe especially Just Above My Head, which is a very difficult novel to read. He was experimenting with what then was called Black English. He was experimenting with lots of things. There was somebody who wrote a wonderful article about Just Above My Head. It was Eleanor Traylor, whom you probably know.
Howard, yeah.
Yeah, who wrote a wonderful essay about that novel and about the promise it held for future work. And that Baldwin was finding a new way of somehow dealing with his disillusionment and with the concept of love that he was always talking about.
I'm glad you mentioned Eleanor Traylor, who was a friend of his, and I remember that essay. I think she called Just Above My Head a blues novel told in a gospel mode.
That's
It's a
right.
fascinating way to think about it.
Exactly, and and this is an indication of what Baldwin was trying to do at the end. And she saw that, and most reviewers didn't.
Right.
They just said it was too complicated, it was too long, and they didn't like some of the figures.
Right.
But she understood exactly what he was trying to do.
Thank you. Other questions is, right here.
So, if I could follow up on that, do you think that love is a blues song told in a gospel mode?
I couldn't hear the question, sorry.
So to make the connection between what you were just speaking on, do you think that Baldwin saw love as a blues song told in a gospel mode?
I think you could say that, yes. I think you could say that not only in connection with the latest novel, but all through his work in a way. I think that's a good way of putting it.
There's a question in the back. And then just to follow up on Professor Love, the epigraph that you use in your book is from both Ezekiel and Bessie Smith. And so Baldwin was always, he saw the sacred in the blues and saw the potential secular in the sacred, so. Yeah.
He did, and that's interesting because when you mentioned the prophets, because I thought you were gonna ask me what Baldwin was really like up close, if I can just interject something before the next
Please.
question. Sometimes living with Baldwin was like living with Jeremiah, because you never knew what was going to happen, because he was a prophet.
Yes.
I mean, I think he felt that. I don't want to say he was obsessed, but he knew his role. Deep down, he knew what his role was, to be a voice in the wilderness, you know. And if somebody made a mistake, said something that led him to have to respond as a prophet, it could be terrifying. It would be like living in a room with Jeremiah. I remember once there was this nice Englishman who was a friend of all of ours, who said to Jimmy one night over dinner in Istanbul that his sister he said, my sister in the Bahamas says that the race situation has become much better there. And suddenly Jimmy's eyes got very large. And he said, fuck your sister in the Bahamas, baby. And then he went on for about an hour. I mean, this poor man, you know, he was in a room with Jeremiah, you know, and then there was a Jeremiah going on, and he was the victim of it, you know. But then at the end of the talk, Love comes in, and he went over and he said, "You okay, baby?" So, I don't know whether that answers any of the questions.
I think it does.
Somewhat in the same vein, could you say a bit more about the relationship between Jimmy Baldwin and Malcolm X?
Between
And the
Baldwin
mask?
and Malcolm X?
Yes,
I
because you would have
think that-
imagined that he would have been somewhat distant from Malcolm rather than a friend, for
Well,
reasons
that's
that I don't need
interesting.
to go into.
Because he was always interested in Malcolm X in a way that he wasn't, let's say, as interested in Martin Luther King, for example. I think with Martin Luther King, he always felt a kind of distance. He always felt, he talked of himself as a street boy, a Harlem boy, whereas Martin Luther King was, you know, a PhD, a Southern white, I mean, something, it was a different world altogether. Whereas with Malcolm X, he felt a kind of likeness. He felt that although he might not agree with him in every aspect of his point of view, that he could feel for him as an individual. And in fact, they did become, at least briefly, friendly. I once actually, I think I mentioned in the talk, that I once, at Jimmy's request, drove him to a meeting that Malcolm had arranged with Baldwin. They had arranged to meet on St. Nicholas Avenue somewhere in a car. And I drove Baldwin there. And Malcolm made it very clear that he did not want me to get into the car, that Jimmy could get into the car, but not me. And I'd say that that Baldwin was definitely interested in Malcolm X. You know, often his interest was psychological, if I could put it that way. He wanted to know more about people that he was close to or potentially could be close to. He was always interested in the psychological quirk, whatever is unusual about the person, whatever is not so clear to be seen. And he was interested in Malcolm X in a way that he was not interested, let's say, in Martin Luther King.
Do you remember what year that was you took him to the meeting?
I was trying to think that it would have been 1965, I think, or 64, 65.
So right there, when he had made that transformation.
Yes, it was a transformative period, and Baldwin was definitely was interested in Malcolm X. In the same way that he was interested in Medgar Evers. He was interested in him as a person, almost more than as a political or public person.
Other questions? Here's one here.
So many questions, so little time. But I'm going to try to distill my thoughts into this one question. I can imagine, I'm projecting here a bit. My name's Joel Branner, by the way. a director of the School of Theater here at George Mason, and I've had a little experience, like you, in writing biographically. Only I tend to write plays more than novels or biographies. But I'm always fascinated by that process, because I think it has to change the biographer.
It does.
And I'm wondering what you might have learned about yourself in this process.
That's a very difficult question to answer, of course. No, it changed my life. Right. But living with him, loving him, and writing the biography certainly changed the way I looked at myself. It changed the whole. I don't know how to even answer that, except to change. Yes, it changed my life. Maybe it made me see people rather than categories. I think if that was Jimmy's main lesson, not only to me, but to the people he was writing for, was that don't try to define me, he used to say. Don't try to define me. I'm a person, I'm a human being. If you want to talk to me as a human being. Which is another way of saying, let love shine forth, let love that involves taking away your mask and your protective warrior clothes and simply be a human being. And that seems obvious, and yet isn't it at the basis of racism today? I mean, if I look at you, I'm not looking at a human being, I'm looking at a black man. If I'm doing that, I'm not, how can I possibly how can there be love between us? The kind of love that Baldwin's talking about. There's a short story that he wrote called Going to Meet the Men, that I was with him, in fact, when he wrote that story. I remember we were on Fire Island, and he had complained to me that the pork chops I made were not as good as the pork chops that his mother made. He was irritable that time. He talked about the fact that well, if you've read that story, you remember that there's a sheriff. And this is a time when sheriffs were big in the news. Bull Connor, you remember, and there were some other sheriffs at the South. And instead of writing about the victims of the Bull Connors in that novel, what does he write about? He writes about the sheriff. And the whole story is told from the point of view of the white sheriff. And his point is, this is what racism does to you. And if you can't find love, then you're doomed to be like that sheriff. And that sheriff, you remember in the story, is attempting to make love, but he can't unless he thinks of a lynching that he remembers when he was a child. I don't know how else to answer that.
Take one more question.
We'll take one more question right here.
Hi, I'm Kel. I'm wondering, you've mentioned Baldwin's Christianity a couple times, and I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how, what religion meant to him and if that changed throughout his life.
It definitely changed. When he was a child, when he was in his early teens, 12, 13, he was an apprentice preacher at a Pentecostal church in Harlem. And he was very good at it. Apparently, he was a brilliant preacher, became sort of notorious. And he then quickly grew out of it somehow. He felt disillusioned by some of the relationships in the church, and essentially by the failure of what you saw as a failure of Christianity to have any effect on the world that he lived in. And eventually, as I said, he still felt the need to preach, and he did all his life. Like the story I just told about he felt the need to preach, but he had to create his own gospel, and it was a gospel of love, but his idea of love. People asked him always, I mean, because of his childhood preaching experience, whether he believed in God, that kind of thing. And he usually said that he believed in something, but he didn't know what it was, just that there was something more than himself. And all he knew was that had to do with love, and must have to do with love. But he was not religious. Although once he took a bunch of us to what was it, Daddy Grace?
Yes.
In Harlem, right? He took us to that church, I think,
At a house of prayer for all.
yes, exactly. And you know, he was obviously he liked it. You know, he enjoyed remembering that, and he enjoyed the experience of the music in the church and the emotional release involved in it. I guess he took me because I came from an Episcopal background. My father was an Episcopal priest, so we were both preachers' kids, but from a very different background. And he thought I needed a little bit of that.
Well, as we close up, I'm gonna recall this quote from the Thorson documentary, and I can't remember if you were quoting Baldwin or if you said this. You said that, or he said, he had to leave the pulpit in order to preach the gospel.
Yeah, I think I did.
You said that, right, and so we want to thank you for taking our pulpit today, because you have really preached something to us today. We have learned something.